At 24, Ilara had already lost the only person who mattered, inherited the contempt of the people who should have been family, and owned a single piece of property the world had declared worthless. All her grandfather Silas left her, after the good land and the small savings were divided among louder, greedier hands, was the deed to 20 acres of mosquito-thick marshland on the county's forgotten edge, a parcel her own uncle, acting as executor, sold to her from the estate for the almost insulting sum of $2,000, the price of a used car. The developer who bought the main farm, a man with a smile as polished and empty as a boardroom table, had laughed when he heard a small, dry sound like leaves skittering across pavement. But what nobody knew, what the developer in his clean shoes and the family in their hurry did not understand, was that Silas never did anything without a reason, and that the marsh, which held the water, also held a secret. That, though, comes later. First there was the funeral, a gray and windswept affair where the eulogies felt like readings from a stranger's biography, sanitized and brief, smoothing over the quiet, stubborn complexities of the man himself. They spoke of his long years in the town, his reliability, his simplicity. No one mentioned the way he could sit for hours, utterly still, just to watch the egret's nest, or the smell of cedar shavings that clung to his flannel shirts, or the calloused silence of his hands that could mend a fence, carve a bird from a block of wood so real it looked like it might breathe, or gently splint the wing of a fallen sparrow. Ilara stood apart from the huddle of dark coats, feeling the cold seep up from the damp earth through the thin soles of her shoes. Her relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins she saw only at events like this, offered her condolences that felt like pats on the head, their eyes already calculating, moving on. They were people who saw the world as a ledger of gains and losses, and Silas, in his final accounting, had not left them as much as they had hoped. The reading of the will was worse. It took place in a stuffy lawyer's office downtown, a room that smelled of old paper and disappointment. Mr. Gable, the lawyer, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently stooped by the weight of other people's grievances, read the document in a monotone. The main farmhouse, the 100 acres of good, arable land, the ancient red barn, all of it was to be sold, the proceeds divided. The accounts, modest but solid, were split 4 ways. Ilara's name was mentioned last, almost as an afterthought. And to my granddaughter, Ilara, Mr. Gable read, peering over his spectacles, I offer the opportunity to purchase, for the sum of $2,000 from my estate, the 20-acre parcel of wetlands bordering the creek, should she so choose. Her Uncle John, a man whose face was perpetually flushed with impatience, snorted. Offer her to buy it? What kind of inheritance is that? It's a swamp, Silas. You're giving the girl a swamp. The developer, Mr. Corbin, was there, invited by John to make his official offer on the farm. He sat perfectly tailored and still, a predator conserving energy. He gave Ilara a brief, pitying glance. The parcel has no commercial value, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. No access, poor drainage. Frankly, it's a liability. But Ilara heard her grandfather's voice in the formal, legal language. Offer the opportunity. It wasn't a command, it was a choice, a question. She felt a sudden, fierce loyalty that burned away the cold grief in her chest. They saw a swamp. Silas had seen something else. He had taken her there as a child, his rough hand in hers, teaching her the names of the reeds, the difference between a heron's call and a bittern's. He had taught her to see the life in the mud, the pattern in the chaos. I'll take it, she said, her voice quiet but clear in the stuffy room. John stared at her. With what money? You don't have $2,000. It was true. She had a few hundred in the bank and a job waitressing that barely covered her rent. But she looked at the faces around the table, faces of people who had shared her grandfather's blood, but not his heart, and she felt an unshakable resolve. I'll find it, she said. The process was humiliating. She borrowed from the one friend she had, sold the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left her, and worked double shifts until her feet were numb and her eyes burned with exhaustion. She handed over the cash, a thick envelope of worn bills, to a smirking Uncle John, who made no secret of his belief that she was a fool. She was left with the deed, a key to a dilapidated shack on the property's edge, and the echoing memory of Mr. Corbin's dry, dismissive laughter. She had bought a liability, a swamp, a place nobody wanted. But as she held the brittle paper of the deed, she felt she was holding the last true piece of her grandfather. They thought they had taken everything of value. They had left her the only thing that mattered. Silas was a man made of quiet accumulations. He accumulated knowledge of the weather not from the television, but from the color of the sky at dawn and the behavior of the crows in the high pines. He accumulated calluses on his hands, each one a record of a tool held, a post driven, a thing repaired. He accumulated silence, using words only when they improved upon the stillness, which, in his estimation, was not often. To the town, he was a fixture, as unremarkable and as constant as the old stone wall that ran along the county road. They saw a farmer who farmed just enough, a widower who kept to himself, an old man growing older. They did not see the artist, the naturalist, the quiet philosopher who lived behind his steady blue eyes. Alara saw him. She remembered sitting in his workshop, the air thick with the sweet, sharp scent of cedar and pine, watching shavings curl from the blade of his knife. He never carved quickly. Each cut was a decision. He would hold a block of tupelo wood for an hour, turning it over and over, feeling the grain, listening, he'd say, for the bird that was already inside. You don't force the shape, he'd told her once, his voice a low rumble. You find it. His decoys were not mere objects, they were distillations of life. The subtle curve of a mallard's neck, the exact shade of russet on a canvasback's head, the alert, intelligent gleam in a glass eye he had set with surgical precision. Collectors from the city sometimes found their way to his door, offering sums that made Alara's young mind reel. He rarely sold. They're not for selling, he would say, after politely closing the door on a man in a crisp suit. They're for watching. He kept them on shelves around his small house, a silent, waiting flock. He treated the marsh with the same reverent attention. He knew its rhythms, its secret languages. He knew where the deer forded the creek in the low water months, where the snapping turtles laid their eggs in the sandy loam, where the rarest orchids bloomed for a single week in the deep shade of the cypress stand. He kept journals, dozens of them, cheap spiral notebooks filled with his cramped, blocky handwriting. In them, he recorded rainfall totals, first frost dates, the arrival and departure of migratory birds, the changing water levels. It was a litany of small, crucial details, a history of a place nobody else bothered to document. Martha, who ran the general store, was one of the few who understood him. She was a woman as sturdy and practical as the oak counter she stood behind every day. When Alara came in, days after the will was read, to buy a few meager supplies, Martha slid a warm meatloaf sandwich across the counter without being asked. Your grandfather was a better man than they gave him credit for, she said, not as a platitude, but as a statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue. Those relatives of yours, they can measure a field for yield, but they can't measure a man's worth. She polished a glass with a clean cloth. He used to come in here, Silas, wouldn't say much, but he'd always ask about people. About old Mrs. Gable's hip, or the Miller boy who lost his job. And next thing you know, a cord of firewood would just appear on the Gables' porch. Or an envelope with $100 cash would be in the Miller's mailbox. He never put his name on it. He didn't need the thanks. This was the man they had dismissed. This was the man whose legacy they had sold off for parts. The wrong done to Alara was not just the coldness, the condescension. It was the deliberate act of erasure. Her Uncle John, in his haste to liquidate and profit, had partnered with Corbin before the funeral dirt was even settled. Corbin wanted the farm, and he wanted it clean. He had walked the property with John, his expensive shoes leaving precise, shallow prints in the soft earth. He had pointed to the marsh on the plat map. "That's a headache," he'd said. "Environmental surveys, drainage issues, it complicates the sale. It would be cleaner if it were a separate parcel." So a plan was hatched in the hushed, carpeted offices of the developer and the dusty, stooped office of the lawyer, Mr. Gable. They would sever the marshland from the main property, undervalue it, and pass it off. They presented it to the family as a burden, a swampy piece of nothing that was dragging down the value of the whole. Let the sentimental girl have it, they reasoned. Let her pay the estate for the privilege of taking a problem off their hands. It was neat. It was transactional. It was a betrayal wrapped in the language of sound financial advice. When Alara drove away from the lawyer's office for the last time, the deed on the passenger seat beside her, she didn't feel like a landowner. She felt like a refugee, carrying the last remnant of a country that no longer existed. They thought they had swindled her into buying a swamp. She was beginning to understand that Silas had arranged for her to rescue a kingdom. The road out to the marsh was more suggestion than fact, two rutted tracks of gravel and mud that dissolved into the tall grasses. Alara's old car complained, its undercarriage scraping against the high center, but she pushed it onward. The air changed as she drove, losing the scent of town, of asphalt and exhaust, and taking on the rich, damp smell of living earth, of decay and generation all at once. She parked where the ruts disappeared, the silence pressing in as soon as she cut the engine. It was a silence made of 1,000 tiny sounds. The rustle of wind in the cattails, the distant metallic cry of a red-winged blackbird, the low hum of insects. It was the sound of her childhood visits. It was the sound of Silas. The shack was just as she remembered it, though smaller, more fragile against the vast, open sky. It leaned a little to the east, as if tired. The gray cedar siding was silvered with age and weather, patched here and there with sheets of tin. A single stone chimney, meticulously built, stood straight and true, a testament to her grandfather's careful hands. Most people would see a ruin, a teardown. Alara saw a sanctuary. The key, heavy and iron, felt cold in her hand. It turned in the lock with a well-oiled click that surprised her. She pushed the door open, and the smell of the inside met her. Cool, dry cedar, a faint trace of wood smoke, and something else, something clean and honest. The single room was sparse, but not empty. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a thick wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. A small, pot-bellied wood stove stood in the center, its black iron surface clean and free of rust. On a rough-hewn table under the window sat a kerosene lamp, its glass chimney spotless, its wick trimmed. This was not a place of abandonment. It was a place of waiting. She ran her hand along the edge of the table. No dust. Someone had been here. Someone had been taking care of the place since Silas had gone. As if summoned by the thought, a low whine came from outside. She turned and saw him standing in the doorway, a ghost of a dog. Gus. Her grandfather's hound, a rangy mix of something with long legs and a longer face, his muzzle now a soft, frosty gray. He was old, his hips were stiff, but his eyes were the same deep, knowing brown. He looked at her, and then he thumped his tail once, a quiet acknowledgement. He had been Silas's shadow, following him everywhere, waiting patiently outside the general store, sleeping at the foot of his bed. The family had talked of taking him to the shelter. Alara had been sick with worry. But here he was. He had come back to the place that mattered. He padded into the room, his claws making a soft clicking on the wooden floorboards. He sniffed her hand, then leaned his heavy head against her leg, a gesture of profound, uncomplicated loyalty. A wave of grief and gratitude so sharp it made her gasp washed over her. She was not alone. She had the shack. And she had Gus. For the first few days, they found their rhythm. Alara worked, cleaning what little needed cleaning, airing out the blanket, sweeping the floor. She made a list of supplies she would need to make the place truly habitable. Gus watched her, a silent, steady presence. But he was more than a companion. He was a keeper of secrets. She noticed it on the second day. He would not come far into the shack. Instead, he spent most of his time lying on the small wooden porch, his nose pointed toward a spot near the back wall, just to the left of the stone chimney. He would lie there for hours, occasionally lifting his head to let out a soft, low whimper. If she went inside, he would rise and pace, always returning to that one spot. He was not just waiting, he was guarding. He was pointing. The shack was the heart of the marsh, and Gus, the loyal witness, was showing her where its pulse was. She walked over to the spot he seemed so fixed upon. It was just a blank wall of weathered siding, no different from the rest. But as she ran her hand over the wood, she felt it. A slight difference in the texture. A newness. The nails here were not rusted like the others. The wood felt smoother, less weathered. Something was not as it seemed. Gus whined again, louder this time, and nudged her hand with his wet nose. He was trying to tell her something Silas had left for her to find. The days took on a shape, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the small, necessary tasks of survival. Ilara drove into town for water and supplies, hoarding her dwindling cash, buying beans and rice, candles and coffee. The rest of the time, she worked on the shack, a slow, methodical reclamation. She patched the small leak in the roof with a tin shingle she found in a corner. She reglazed the single window, the putty firming up under her patient fingers. She cleaned the chimney, her arms and face smeared with soot, emerging into the clean air feeling accomplished and exhausted. With each task completed, the shack felt less like a shelter and more like a home. It was in the small details that she found her grandfather again. The way the axe handle was worn smooth just where her own hand fit. The neat stack of kindling, each piece perfectly sized, ready by the stove. The row of tin cans on a shelf, their labels removed, filled with nails and screws sorted by size. It was the grammar of a deliberate, careful life. And all the while, Gus maintained his vigil. His spot was near the wood stove inside, a specific section of the floorboards that ran parallel to the hearth. He would lie there, his chin on his paws, his old eyes fixed on the planks. When she stoked the fire, he would rise and move away, but as soon as she was done, he would return, nudging one particular board with his nose, then looking up at her, his expression a clear, unquestioning summons. This was the anomaly, the thing that did not fit. She had swept these floors a dozen times. They were solid, made of thick, old-growth pine, worn to a soft, silvery gray in the high-traffic areas. But the boards by the stove, the ones Gus insisted on, were different. The color was a shade lighter. The grain was tighter. The seams between them were too perfect, too clean. Someone had replaced this section of the floor. And they had done it with meticulous care, so that a casual glance would reveal nothing. She knelt, her knees protesting on the hard wood, and ran her fingers along the seam Gus had indicated. It was flawless. But then she pressed down. There was a give, a tiny, almost imperceptible springiness that wasn't present in the surrounding floor. She pushed harder. A low click echoed in the quiet room. The entire section of flooring, about 3 feet square, lifted a fraction of an inch on one side. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't a patch. It was a door. She looked for a handle, a notch, anything to grip, but there was nothing. It was designed to be seamless. She went to the small workbench in the corner and came back with a pry bar, wrapping the end in a rag to protect the wood. She worked it gently into the crack and levered it up. The panel lifted smoothly, silently, on hidden hinges. Beneath it was not the dirt foundation she expected, but a dark, rectangular void. A space lined with galvanized steel, like a small, fireproof safe set into the earth. And inside, nestled on a bed of old, dry canvas, was a single metal box, an old army surplus ammunition can, its lid clamped shut. A wave of cold air rose from the opening, smelling of damp earth and metal and time. Gus peered into the hole, then looked at her and gave a short, satisfied bark. His job was done. Her hands trembled as she reached down and lifted the box. It was heavy, solid. She carried it to the table and set it in the pool of light from the window. For a long moment, she just stared at it, at the faded green paint and the stenciled lettering. This was it. This was the secret the Marsh held. This was what Silas had hidden from the world, and what he had trusted only her to find. With fumbling fingers, she worked the latch. It was stiff, but it gave way with a loud snap. She lifted the lid. There was no gold, no cash, no treasure in the conventional sense. The box was filled to the brim with the cheap, spiral-bound notebooks she recognized instantly. Her grandfather's journals. And beneath them, a series of rolled-up maps tied with twine and a thick oilcloth-wrapped parcel. It was not a fortune, it was a story. The story of the Marsh, of a life, of a promise he had made to the land itself, and now had passed on to her. She spent the next several days immersed in the past, the shack filled with the dry, papery scent of old notebooks. She read by the light of the kerosene lamp, its steady golden glow making the small room a warm island in the vast, dark marsh. Gus slept at her feet, his occasional snores the only sound besides the turning of pages and the whisper of the wind outside. The journals were a revelation. They were more than just records of rainfall and bird sightings. They were a testament to a deep and abiding love affair with a piece of land most people saw as useless. Silas had documented the life of the Marsh with the precision of a scientist and the soul of a poet. He wrote of the green fire of the algae bloom in late summer, the shattered glass of the first ice on the creek, the slow-motion ballet of the sandhill cranes during their spring migration. He knew every ripple and current, every stand of trees, every hidden pool. But as she read deeper, moving from the notebooks of the last decade to ones from 20, then 30 years ago, a different kind of entry began to appear. Interspersed with notes on flora and fauna were clippings from old newspapers, articles about county zoning board meetings, regional development plans, and geological surveys. He had been tracking the world outside the Marsh, the world of money and power, with the same diligence he tracked the seasons. Beneath the journals were the maps. She unrolled them carefully on the floor, weighting the corners with stones. They were geological surveys from the 1950s and 60s, crisscrossed with lines and notations in her grandfather's hand. He had been mapping, not the surface of the land, but what lay deep beneath it. One map had a large area circled in red pencil, an area that encompassed not only his 20 acres, but a vast swath of the surrounding county. In the margin, he had written a single word, shale. And then she found it, tucked inside the oilcloth parcel. It was a legal document, stiff with age, the type dense and formal. It was a mineral rights lease, dated 1958. It stated that Silas, for the sum of $100, had purchased the exclusive rights to all subsurface minerals for the 20-acre parcel from the county, which had seized the land for back taxes from a defunct timber company. At the time, it would have been a meaningless purchase. The technology to extract anything from the deep shale didn't exist. It was a gamble on a future no one could see. A $100 bet on a secret buried miles underground. Tucked into the folded lease was a more recent document, a letter from a Houston-based energy consortium. It was a formal inquiry, dated 2 years prior, expressing interest in activating the lease, citing new extraction technologies. There was a figure mentioned, a staggering number that made her feel dizzy. But it was tied to a clause in the original lease, a clause Silas himself had clearly highlighted in yellow. It was a non-extraction clause, something almost unheard of. It stipulated that the owner of the surface land held the ultimate right to refuse drilling, and if that right was exercised, the consortium was obligated to pay a penalty, a preservation stipend, to the landowner for the full market value of the inaccessible resource. It was a poison pill, designed not to make money, but to prevent destruction. Silas hadn't bought a lottery ticket. He had built a shield. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the part where quiet knowledge, held patiently for half a century, rises up to meet loud, impatient greed. It is the part where a place everyone called worthless is revealed to be priceless, and a young woman everyone underestimated finds out how strong she really is. It is the part where the real inheritance is not the money, but the choice, the responsibility, and the continuation of a quiet, stubborn promise made to a piece of wild land. The choice was never about the money, it was about the marsh. And the fight for it was just beginning. A week later, the world came back to the marsh. It arrived in a cloud of dust, a late-model black sedan, impossibly clean, navigating the rutted track with a slow, grinding determination. Mr. Corbin got out, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from the sleeve of his tailored jacket. He looked at the shack, at the curl of smoke rising from the chimney, at Elara standing on the porch, and his polished smile was tight with something that was not amusement. "Quite the homesteader," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He stopped a polite distance away, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground. "I was surprised to hear you were living out here. It can't be comfortable." "It's fine," Elara said. Gus, standing beside her, let out a low growl, a sound like distant thunder. "I came to make you an offer," Corbin said, ignoring the dog. "My company, we're consolidating some of the smaller, unmanaged parcels in the area for a conservation easement. Good PR, you understand. We'd be willing to take this land off your hands. Pay you, say, $10,000 for it. A nice little profit for you on your $2,000 investment." He said it like he was bestowing a great kindness upon her, a gift. But his eyes were sharp, analytical. They darted past her, scanning the land, the creek, the tree line. He was looking for something. "No thank you," Elara said. "I'm not interested in selling." Corbin's smile didn't falter, but it lost all its warmth. "Miss, with all due respect, this is a swamp. It has no practical value. 10,000 is more than generous. It's enough for a down payment on a nice condo in a town with opportunities. A real future." "I like it here," she said, her voice betraying none of the frantic beating of her heart. She could feel the weight of the journals in the shack behind her, the crisp, damning paper of the lease. "Let's be frank," he said, his tone shifting, losing its patronizing edge and taking on a harder, colder one. "My company is planning a significant investment in this region. A pipeline easement will be required. It will run right through this area. We can do this the easy way, where you walk away with a nice check, or we can do this the hard way, through eminent domain. In that case, the county will assess the land's value, which, I assure you, is next to nothing. You'll get a few $100s and a lot of legal fees. The choice is yours." It was a threat, delivered with the pleasant cadence of a weather report. He believed he held all the cards. He saw a young, broke woman living in a shack, an obstacle to be removed, not an opponent to be reckoned with. What he didn't know was that she was not just defending a piece of land. She was defending her grandfather's life's work. "I'll take my chances," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, his calculation failing. This was not the expected response. He nodded curtly. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers." He got back in his car and drove away, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and the unsettling feeling of a battle line being drawn. The stakes were no longer just about preserving a piece of nature. They were about her home, her inheritance, her right to exist on this small patch of earth. That afternoon, she saw the survey stakes for the first time. They were thin wooden poles topped with bright pink plastic ribbons, driven into the ground at the far eastern edge of her property. They hadn't been there a week ago. They marked a clear, straight path, cutting directly through the heart of the cypress stand where the rarest orchids grew, the place Silas had called the Marsh's cathedral. The fight had come to her. Now she had to figure out how to fight back. She went back inside and unrolled the maps again, her grandfather's maps. She spread them next to the modern plat map she'd gotten from the county. She started tracing lines, comparing boundaries, looking for any discrepancy, any leverage. And she read the journals again, this time not for the poetry, but for the evidence. She was looking for the shield her grandfather had spent a lifetime building. At the very bottom of the ammunition can, beneath the last of the journals, was the one thing she hadn't yet touched. It was a thick manila envelope, sealed not with glue but with a large, messy splotch of dark red wax, the kind used for important documents long ago. It felt different from the rest, more personal. Her name was written on the front in her grandfather's familiar, blocky script. Just her name, Elara. Her hands were unsteady as she broke the seal. The wax crumbled, smelling faintly of smoke and age. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. It was a letter. The paper was thick and soft, and the ink had feathered slightly. The date at the top was from 6 months before he died. He must have known he was fading. He must have prepared this, just as he had prepared everything else. "My dearest Elara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you found your way here, and you found my work. I am sorry to leave such a burden on your shoulders, but there was no one else I could trust with it. Not with the land, and not with the choice. Your family, they are good people in their own way, but they see the world in dollars and cents. They would not have understood. You, I think, will. You always saw the birds, not just the sky. By now, you have found the lease. It must look like a winning lottery ticket. It is not. It is a weapon. And a promise. I bought those rights in '58 for next to nothing. I'd read a government report about the geology of this region, a report everyone else ignored. I knew, even then, what was down there, sleeping under the mud and the water. For years, it was just a piece of paper. Then, about 10 years ago, the letters started coming. The oilmen had new ways of getting things out of the ground. They wanted the shale. They made offers. Big ones. It would have been easy to sell. It would have made me a rich man. But I would have been the poorest man in the world. I would have sold this place. I would have sold the cranes, and the egrets, and the sound of the wind in the reeds. I would have sold the silence. Some things aren't for selling. They're for keeping. So I used their own greed against them. I found a clever young lawyer, not from around here, and we drafted the non-extraction clause. We made it part of any negotiation. It was a shield. The money they offer is not a prize. It is a penalty for their own destructive appetite. It is the price they must pay for being told no. And now the choice is yours. The money, the full 18 million the last offer stood at, is enough to change your life forever. You could walk away from here, and no one would blame you. Or you could use it to keep the promise, to protect this place not just for our lifetime, but for all the lifetimes to come. You could build a fortress around it, a legal and financial one, that no developer, no pipeline, no greedy man could ever tear down. I do not tell you what to choose. A gift with conditions is not a gift. This is your inheritance, the land, the secret, and the freedom to decide its fate. Whatever you do, know that you were the best part of my life, the one I was most proud of. You have a good heart, Elara. Trust it. It knows the way. He had signed it simply, your grandfather, Silas. She folded the letter and held it to her chest, the tears she had held back for months finally falling, hot and silent. It was a permission slip, a blessing, a transfer of guardianship. He had not left her a swamp. He had not left her a fortune. He had left her a purpose. The weight of it was immense. But for the first time since he died, she did not feel lost. She felt anchored. She knew what she had to do. She had to learn how to use the weapon he had left her. She had to learn how to say no, not just for herself, but for the cranes and the egrets and the silence. She had to fight. The town hall meeting was called by Mr. Corbin's company under the guise of a community information session. The reality was a power play, a public spectacle designed to paint Alara as an unreasonable holdout standing in the way of progress and jobs. The room was packed, the air thick with the scent of damp wool coats and nervous anticipation. On one side sat Corbin, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers from the city. On the other side sat most of the town, their faces a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and hope. Alara sat alone in the front row, a simple canvas tote bag on her lap. She had spent the last week in the town library, then in a consultation with a legal aid lawyer from the next county over, a young, earnest woman who had initially been skeptical, then wide-eyed, then fiercely supportive. She was as prepared as she could be. Mr. Corbin began with a slick presentation, full of colorful charts and projected images of a gleaming pipeline. He spoke of energy independence, of tax revenue for the struggling town, of construction jobs. He was smooth, persuasive, and utterly confident. Then he put up a map, a large red line showing the proposed easement. It cut directly across a parcel shaded in gray. "This entire project," he said, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity, "a project that will benefit every single person in this room, is being held up by a single, unresolved land acquisition." He gestured toward the gray blotch. "This parcel of undevelopable wetlands. The owner has refused all reasonable offers. We have been forced to pursue eminent domain through the county council, a process that is costly and time-consuming for everyone, but one we will win, because the public good must prevail." He did not use her name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room turned to Alara. She could feel their judgment, their impatience. She was the problem. The town council chairman, a nervous man named Peters, cleared his throat. "Miss," he said, avoiding her eyes, "do you have anything to say?" Alara stood up. Her hands were shaking, but she held her voice steady. She walked to the podium, placing her tote bag on it. She did not look at Corbin. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, people who had known her grandfather her whole life. "My name is Alara," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the hushed room. "That piece of land was my grandfather's, Silas. Some of you knew him." She saw a few nods. She reached into her bag and pulled out, not a legal document, but one of the old spiral notebooks. "My grandfather loved that marsh. He spent more than 50 years watching it, listening to it, and writing down what he learned." She opened the notebook. "In the spring of 1982, she read, the sandhill cranes returned on March 14th, 3 nesting pairs. The water level in the vernal pools was the highest it had been in a decade. He noted that the cypress stand, the one this pipeline will destroy, is a critical nesting habitat for the prothonotary warbler, a species whose numbers have been in decline for 20 years. She turned a page. He documented over 150 species of birds in that marsh. He found 7 varieties of native orchid. He recorded the cycles of the fireflies and the chorus of the frogs. This isn't an empty swamp. It's a living, breathing place. A sanctuary. Corbin shifted in his seat, his smile gone. This was not the argument he had prepared for. "That's all very sentimental," one of his lawyers interjected, "but it has no legal bearing." "This does," Alara said. She reached into her bag again and pulled out the original mineral rights lease from 1958. She laid the stiff, yellowed paper on the podium. "This is a lease my grandfather purchased 60 years ago. It grants him, and now me, as his heir, the exclusive subsurface mineral rights to that parcel." A confused murmur went through the room. Corbin's face was a mask of controlled fury. He knew what it was. He had been trying to get the land before she found it. "And this," she said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "is the critical part." She held up the highlighted clause, the letter from the Energy Consortium. "This is a non-extraction clause. It gives the surface owner the absolute right to refuse drilling. And if that right is exercised, your company," she said, looking directly at Corbin for the first time, is legally obligated by a contract your own parent company signed to pay a preservation stipend of $18 million. The room erupted. The figure, so huge and unbelievable, hung in the air. Corbin was on his feet, his face pale. "This is absurd! That document is ancient, likely invalid." But he was cut off by a new voice. Mr. Gable, the town lawyer, who had been sitting silently in the back, stood up. His face was ashen, his shoulders more stooped than ever. "It's valid," he said, his voice cracking with shame. "I checked the county records myself. The lease is ironclad." He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a miserable apology. Mr. Corbin knew about the dormant lease. He found it during his initial title search. He pressured me to sever the parcel and sell it quickly, for a pittance, before anyone had a chance to look too closely at the old deed filings. He told me it was just a business tactic. I knew it was wrong. I knew Silas. And I did it anyway. The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. The town had turned on Corbin, their murmurs growing to angry shouts. He was not a benefactor. He was a predator, and he had tried to swindle the granddaughter of a man they had all, on some level, respected. The climax was not loud or violent. It was the quiet, devastating weight of the truth falling into place. Alara stood at the podium, holding a 60-year-old piece of paper, and watched as a multi-million-dollar project crumbled into dust. In the chaotic aftermath of the meeting, as Mr. Corbin and his legal team made a hasty retreat through a gauntlet of angry townspeople, Mr. Gable approached Alara. He did not make excuses. He did not try to minimize what he had done. His face was a portrait of profound shame. "There is nothing I can say that will make it right," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I betrayed your grandfather's memory, and I helped them try to cheat you. Greed is a disease, and fear is its accomplice. I was afraid of losing the business Corbin's company was bringing to my small practice. I let that fear make me a coward." Alara looked at him, at this man who was a pillar of the small community, now broken and exposed. She saw no satisfaction in his humiliation, only a deep sadness. Silas had never been a man for vengeance. He had been a man for mending things. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I will make a full statement to the State Bar Association," he said. "I'll likely be disbarred. It's no less than I deserve. But before that, I want to make what amends I can. I will work for you, pro bono, for as long as it takes. We will use their own contract against them. We will enforce the non-extraction clause. We will set up the trust to protect that land in perpetuity. I will undo what I have done, not to be forgiven, but because it is the only right thing to do." He was the redeemable man, the one who, when faced with his own failure, chose the difficult path of atonement over the easy path of denial. His confession had been the final, crucial piece, turning the tide of public opinion and sealing Corbin's defeat. The days that followed were a blur. The story was picked up by the regional paper, then a national newswire. "Small-town girl uses grandfather's secret weapon to halt pipeline." Reporters came, but Alara spoke to few of them. She let the documents and Mr. Gable's diligent legal work speak for themselves. The Energy Consortium, faced with a public relations nightmare and an ironclad contract, capitulated. They fought to lower the payout, but the terms were clear. The check that arrived was not for $18 million, but for a negotiated $17.5, a figure that was still beyond the realm of imagination. Alara never touched a penny of the principal. Working with Gable and a team of environmental lawyers, she established the Silas Marsh Preserve, a nonprofit trust endowed with the full sum. The money would be used to maintain the land, to purchase adjacent buffer zones, to fund educational programs, and to ensure that no developer could ever threaten it again. The true denouement was not the arrival of the money, but the arrival of the people. One Saturday morning, a pickup truck rumbled down her lane. It was Mr. Miller, the son of the man Silas had helped years ago. He had a truck full of lumber. "Heard you might be fixing the place up," he said, not quite meeting her eye. Figured your grandfather would want it to be solid. An hour later, another car arrived, and then another. People from the town, some of whom had looked at her with suspicion just weeks before, came with hammers and tool belts, with coolers of food and thermoses of coffee. Martha came from the general store and set up a table, handing out sandwiches, her presence a firm, maternal blessing on the whole affair. They were the community chorus, arriving to repay a debt to a man who had never sent a bill. They fixed the roof, built a new porch, and began clearing a small nature trail, their laughter and the sound of their work echoing across the water. They were not just rebuilding a shack. They were rebuilding the very idea of community, of looking after one another, of honoring a quiet legacy. Elara, standing in the midst of it all, handing a nail to one person and a glass of water to another, finally understood the full scope of her inheritance. It wasn't the land or the money or the victory. It was this sense of belonging, this found family, cohering around a shared purpose. She had not become a wealthy woman. She had become a steward, a keeper of the flame, and the work was just beginning. Spring came fully to the marsh, a riot of green and birdsong. The air was soft, smelling of damp earth and new leaves. The shack was no longer a leaning relic, but a sturdy, welcoming little building, its new porch facing the sunrise. A simple, hand-carved sign near the road now read, "Silas Marsh Preserve, open to all who walk softly." The community's work had not stopped. Volunteers had built a narrow boardwalk that snaked out over the wetlands, allowing visitors to see the heart of the marsh without disturbing its fragile ecosystem. School groups had started to come, children with wide eyes pointing at turtles sunning on a log, or a great blue heron standing motionless in the shallows. Elara had become the preserve's quiet, unofficial warden. She led the walks, answered the questions, and spent her evenings just as her grandfather had, sitting on the porch, watching the light fade, and listening to the marsh's evening chorus. Gus, older and slower now, would lie at her feet, his head on her boots, his duty fulfilled. One late afternoon, a dusty old sedan with out-of-state plates pulled over by the sign. A man got out, his shoulders slumped with weariness. A woman and two small children followed, their faces tired and strained. Their car had broken down, the man explained. They were on their way to a new job, a new life, and everything they owned was packed in the car. They had no money for a tow truck, let alone a mechanic. They were stranded and adrift. Elara looked at them, at the worry in the parents' eyes and the restless boredom of the children. She saw not a problem, but a need. She remembered Martha sliding a sandwich across the counter, an unsolicited act of simple, profound kindness. She remembered the stories of Silas leaving firewood on a neighbor's porch, no name attached. The legacy was not a possession to be guarded, it was an action to be repeated. She smiled. "You must be hungry," she said. "Come on up to the house." She went inside the small shack and returned a few minutes later with a plate of thick sandwiches, glasses of cold water, and 2 apples for the children. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer pity. She just offered food and a safe place to rest for a moment. The family ate in grateful silence on the steps of the porch. Later, Elara used the preserve's emergency phone to call the only mechanic in town, a man who had helped rebuild her porch, and quietly arranged to pay for the tow and the repair. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden rays across the water, the mechanic's truck arrived. The family, their faces transformed by relief, tried to thank her, tried to offer the little cash they had. She gently refused. "My grandfather used to say, 'Some things aren't for selling,'" she told them, the words feeling as natural and true as breathing. "They're for keeping. And some things aren't for paying back, they're for passing on." She had completed the circle. The quiet, uncredited act of goodness had been passed to a new generation, to a new stranger on the road. After they had gone, Elara stood on the porch with Gus, watching the last of the light paint the sky in shades of violet and rose. The air was cool and clean. A pair of sandhill cranes, their calls echoing like ancient trumpets, flew low over the water, their huge wings beating a steady, timeless rhythm. She was 25 years old, had no money to her name, and lived in a tiny shack on the edge of a swamp. And she was the richest person she had ever known. She had her grandfather's home, his purpose, and his heart. She was the keeper of the marsh. And the legacy was alive.